Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Friday, May 22nd, 2020. I'm a little bit excited because I have more things to talk about this week. However, one of them isn't a continuation of Carry Her Home, short stories by Caroline Bock, which I've slowly been reading through for the last couple of weeks, really barely making any bit of a dent in them. I'm not very good at reading things so piecemeal, and next week I think I'm just going to sit down and completely finish this. It's very short and enjoyable, and it should be good. What I did start and finish instead is The Girl of Fire and Thorns by Carson. I picked this book in my last video that I made at the beginning of the week. It was a page 112 tag video where I picked out this book and two others from my unread shelves and read page 112 and decided I wanted to continue along with this book. This is a YA fantasy, the start of a trilogy. I'm reading a lot of heavier stuff. I thought it would be fun to dip into something more escapist. That being said, I think there are some similarities in this book and some of the other books I've read, and I'm kind of glad I gravitated toward it because, well, there's some world-building aspects in this that I really love in fantasy, particularly, well, I love epic fantasy, that's my favorite. And this one definitely has a lot to do with the idea of gods and religion. And it's been interesting. I mean, I've only slightly dipped into Goodreads, really. I can't really say too much, but I have seen some backlash against the idea of having religion in fantasy, and I guess particularly because the religion in this fantasy does feel very familiar. It really, to me, feels a fair bit like Catholicism in a broad, sweeping way, and especially because another big influence is a sort of Hispanic cultural aspect to this world. I don't know, maybe if the religion in this book was less Christian in a way, Christian inspired, I should say, maybe more secular fans would like it better. I mean, there's an interview with Carson in the back of this, which points out that there's a lot of religious folks in, this country, because she's American, and we have a fair amount of religious folks, and to think that nobody wants to see religion in their stories is baffling. Although I kind of wonder if Christians would be drawn to sort of a Christian-inspired religion, I guess. It's just something I'm also thinking about because I am myself in the beginning stages of writing a fantasy based on Judaism, like inspired by Jewish religious aspects. So I don't know. But I guess my thought about it is that, well, I'm a big person for world building, and I like Maximus stories when it comes to science fiction and fantasy, and it's ludicrous, really, to be creating an entirely new world, and you have to think about people living together and what sort of culture and what sort of beliefs would crop up, because people don't just believe in nothing, or people don't just think like we do in our particular society, if this society, like so many epic fantasy societies, is much more agrarian and sort of medieval based, perhaps. But anyway, all of that being said, I was a little disappointed with the world building. There was the potential there, but I don't really think that Carson saw it all the way through. And I think that harkens back to that this is YA fantasy, and YA fantasy much more often is encumbered to the plot. I don't know. I mean, what I hear and what seems to be true is that YA fantasy, for the most part, is much more fast-paced. I mean, I think in one of the first chapters we had a battle on the road and a character died and the main character was distraught, and I'm like, well, I don't really know or care that much yet. And then later throughout the rest of the book, it's interesting because then I went on to YouTube, onto BookTube, and heard some people who really liked this book, and I think they didn't think it was too fast, but I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a literary fiction reader that, fast means different things to me, and I thought this was very fast, and I thought that there was always some sort of external conflict always going on in terms of either a battle happening or preparing for battle or that sort of thing, and that she didn't really give enough time to set her main character Elisa up with other characters and get to know them and get to know the world around her. Elisa is a princess who is married off to a king in a neighboring kingdom, and it could have been a good chance for her to, I don't know, sit down and study and learn about courtly politics or something, but everything was just so fast-paced and external all the time. Even though she does get a bit of a character arc, it's just that there was so much plot that I didn't invest as deeply into her character arc and her relationships until very significantly later into the story. I liked all the potential. She was an overweight princess. That's not something we usually see in fantasy, and that also comes along with the idea of bullying and lack of self-esteem, and you know, this is YA, and it's nice to get that perspective in for the teens to see, and for other readers to see. I liked the fantastical elements. Elisa is a godstone bearer, meaning that she is the one in her generation that God has put this sort of gemstone into her belly button, and it's supposed to mark her for some sort of greatness, that she's supposed to, I guess, have some magical sort of ability to counteract the people that her people are in conflict with. And she doesn't know what that is, and the other godstone bearers, their backstories are incredibly flaky, and it seems like most of them don't even accomplish that much. And I'm fine with that, having to go on a journey to discover your destiny, even and especially as a chosen one. But I felt like the people around her and the culture around her was very shallow in comparison. Like, what do they do? What do they believe? They can't just sit there in some sort of stasis waiting for her to save them. I mean, it would be a pretty boring story that way. I think there's hints that this conflict with their enemy of mages, people who have some sort of blood magic stuff, it's a little more complicated than, you know, good versus evil, I guess. One of the things we do get from this book is that they do seem to believe in the same god, or at least the same idea of having the right prophecy for that god, which I quite like, rather than, I don't know, angels versus demons or something like that. I really love the idea of ideologies clashing in a more intimate sort of way, and a reminder too that, like, in the real world we have different faiths with similar mythologies, and even in her own society, like her kingdom had different views about how to prepare her as the bearer for her duties versus what her husband's kingdom thinks of it. And I think that's all very fascinating, and I think we should have gotten a little more into that stuff rather than immediately into all of the danger plot. I think we should have fleshed out some of this theological stuff a little earlier on, because I do think it'll come, I guess, in these later books, but I don't think I'm invested enough to continue along with the series. But it has a lot of tropes that I really do like, so it was an interesting ride. Next, staying on the topic of religion, and in fact diving deep into the Maybe Midrash Readathon, I am finally reading Here All Along, Finding Meaning, Spirituality, and a Deeper Connection to Life in Judaism, after finally choosing to look there, by Sarah Hurwitz. This was the book that I put on my Readathon TBR for my nonfiction pick. The Maybe Midrash Readathon is a booktube-led initiative to read about any world religion in fiction or nonfiction this month. And I am so glad that I finally got to this. I think it's what I was looking for, and then some. Although I have to admit, I think I read a lot of it in a rush 2 days ago, and I didn't read it all yesterday, which is ridiculous, so I'm feeling a weird sense of vertigo with this book right now, because I'm not, you know, as immediately into it, and maybe I had a little bit of a sugar rush, because there's just so much that I agree with Hurwitz about in this book. I really love her take on things. She was, like me, raised in Judaism, and had the dispiriting backstory, if you will, of being dragged against her will to Hebrew school, where, you know, after a long school day already, some synagogue teachers would try to force her to learn some Hebrew words, and some vague, one-dimensional Bible stories, basically. And that was it. And as an adult, she tried to kind of get more involved in little ways in the community, like going to a Shabbat dinner in college or that sort of thing. But one of the things that you realize when you aren't that involved in the community as a child and then you leave it entirely is that once you try to go back to the community, you're really an outsider, and, you know, you run into a bunch of people who know each other through Jewish camps or what have you, or just generally much more knowledgeable about, you know, Shabbat and rituals and history and all sorts of things. So, you know, it's difficult to stay invested. But she finally made the plunge when she was looking for an activity to do in her 30s after her boyfriend broke up with her, and she was looking to pass the time with, you know, a distraction. And there was an Intro to Judaism class at the local JCC, and she was stunned by what she found there. And I think what she found, was a much more adult religion. And she's not really out and out saying it, but there is a disconnect really between what we teach kids versus what you can get out of Judaism as an adult, which most Jews don't get out of Judaism because they never get past that hurdle of being kids. They just feel this nostalgia for that Judaism and maybe might want their kids to go to Hebrew school and repeat, maybe. I mean, there is also a little bit in here about, you know, the changing American norms, because American Jews are so much more assimilated now. We don't just live in Jewish neighborhoods anymore. So now more people don't send their kids to Hebrew school in order to feel Jewish, because Judaism now is sort of a more vague cultural idea that's probably way too wrapped up in Larry David characters for my liking. But anyway, she's going into the Bible, talking about you know, what's on the page in terms of a narrative in the Bible, and then also talking about the idea of, instead of looking for literal meaning, going into more emotional meaning about what it meant for these stories to be written in the time that they were, and that it was rather revolutionary, some of the practices that the Torah lays out for that time. And she also goes into something else, I believe, is that Judaism has always been a interpretive and reinterpretive religion. And I mean, not just since the 20th century or assimilation or whatever. I mean, ever since the first century, you know, since the Romans, you know, forced the Jews into diaspora and burned down the temple. And that was what Judaism was back then. It was a temple religion. And it was very based in that place and time. And once that place was taken from them, they had a choice. Either you could completely assimilate and forget your religious heritage, or you could adapt it. And from there, a bunch of rabbis started to sit down and start to think of new rituals and new meanings of being Judaism, and they would interpret and reinterpret the text because they couldn't shut up. And it's something that is passed on to us today, and it's just very meaningful, and it's about finding that balance between, you know, letting a religion evolve without just, you know, ignoring the parts you like just cause. You have to confront some things still in Judaism. I've just got through the first part of this so far. I'm sure there's more to come. I've been taking lots of copious notes, which isn't my usual in books that I read, and God knows I won't be able to read my own handwriting. Maybe ever. But you know, this is the sort of thing that speaks to me in my own journey, so I figure I will be keeping this book, and it might be nice to have a record of my own thoughts of how I engage with this woman who has a somewhat similar experience to me, because like her, I left Judaism after my bat mitzvah, and I came back when I was about 18, a bit earlier than her, so I feel even worse that, like, maybe I should be further along than I am, but I guess we all are where we are. And one thing I find really interesting about her is that she's not incredibly observant herself. and she takes a lot of her Jewish identity aspect into studying the texts, even though she doesn't always keep kosher or keep Shabbat or that sort of thing. And it's just been something I've been mulling around with myself because, you know, if you watch this channel, you know, I read a lot of Jewish fiction and Jewish history, and I'd like to get more into reading more about Jewish religion too. I do belong to a synagogue, unlike Hurwitz, and I occasionally take classes there as well, but I would like to read more on my own, I guess, religious texts and midrashim, as they are, the commentaries on the text. And with that in mind, and keeping in mind that this readathon isn't named Maybe Midrash, the Talmud includes a number of stories referred to as midrashim, plural of midrash, to fill in gaps or elucidate points made in the Torah. To imagine, as Rabbi Lawrence Kushner puts it, what might have happened before and after, above and below the biblical story. Many midrashim were also collected in separate volumes. Midrashim can be quite fanciful. Two of my favorites have to do with the Israelites' escape from Egypt. The first imagines that they reached the Sea of Reeds and were seized with fear, refusing to move forward. Moses unhelpfully stands at the shore, praying to God for help. Finally, a man named Nachshon ben Amimadab decides to take the plunge, followed by many members of his tribe. And only when he's nearly in over his head does God intervene, bellowing at Moses, "My beloved ones are drowning in the sea, and you prolong your prayer to me?" God then parts the sea and lets the Israelites cross. Just standing around praying isn't enough, and sometimes you have to get far beyond your comfort zone before things work out. The other midrash is about how, after the Israelites cross the Sea of Reeds and it crashes down on the Egyptians, a group of angels wants to break into celebratory song. But God rebukes them, declaring, "My creations are drowning in the sea, and you are singing?" Again, chosenness does not mean that God loves the Jews more than other people. And in fact, what Hurwitz discovers through her close reading of the text is that God often aligns God's self with the underdogs, with the poor and the ones without much power in whatever means. And is a little wary of the fact that when you get power, you can often abuse it, and then it could harken back to a line I'll paraphrase from the Torah about, "Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and you were strangers, and to watch out for the stranger," or the ger, which is definitely a Hebrew word that pops out to me because I hear it said so often. So anyway, I will be back, I think in June, when I finish this and my fiction pick, hopefully I'll be back to talk about them on this channel more in depth. But for now, I'll focus on what's next on my docket, which is Charged, the new movement to transition American prosecution and end mass incarceration by Emily Bazelon, which I believe will be some case studies of people who are incarcerated in the American prison system, and how that prison system kind of sucks people in great numbers and is its own thing that maybe isn't so much focused on reform as much as it is, well, I guess I'll let Bazelon tell me herself in this. I will be reading this for the BookTube Prize. The BookTube Prize is an annual prize where people in and adjacent to the BookTube community whittle down last year's best in fiction, literary fiction, and nonfiction. We have several rounds that go throughout the year. Right now we are in the quarterfinals round. This is the last book I am reading for my Group C in my quarterfinals round, and at the end of the month I will have to submit my ballot about what I think ranking-wise is 1 to 6 out of all of them. So anyway, I will link down to the BookTube Prize information down below because I won't be talking about this book again until after the quarterfinals conclude. So that about covers it for me now. It's been a strange week, although I guess we can say that about every week in these times. But my nephew turned 2 years old on Tuesday, and I didn't make it in person for the party, and I ended up calling in on a Zoom call with some friends and family to wish him happy birthday and watch him open some presents and eat some cake. I miss him, and I miss my niece, and I miss seeing them in person, although it has still been fascinating to watch them grow as they do through my constant video chats, or so it seems. My nephew knows my name now, although I don't know how he'll respond to me in person anymore, rather than on his screen he can turn off. Maryland is slowly opening up again after, or as we ride the downward curve, hopefully continuing in this pandemic, which means for me that I'm casting an eye on some doctor's visits and I kind of have a separate problem with that, in that right before the pandemic my employer switched insurance companies, and so I have to do extra paperwork again for all of these appointments. And I'm also not entirely sure how long my employer will cover me, because I've been on furlough for a while, but luckily most of the contracts my employer covers are still in business and can work from home, so they're kind of carrying me right now, I guess, but we'll have to see how things go. Also had a work meeting, which was basically we don't know when we'll be moving again. But I'm grateful to be remembered during these crazy times when I feel so distant from everybody and my normal routines. And I hope the rest of you feel like your physical and emotional needs are being met, and of course your bookish needs as well. And I'll be looking forward to seeing your videos on BookTube. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.